Let us begin with today's lecture. As yesterday, we have already discussed about what Aristotle is commenting, and Aristotle is making his remarks on imitation as one of the most important part of any creative process. And even yesterday, we have discussed that in one of his books, Parts of Animals, Aristotle explains how pleasure can be achieved. And even he has pointed out that the roots, he roots the visual arts in human desire for knowledge, that human, for the sake of knowledge, tried to use visual arts as one of the most important medium to understand, to know how exactly the whole process of knowledge can be acquired. Continuing with the same sort of discussion as we have yesterday seen, that the sort of example given by Aristotle, that you can enjoy painting, as he said, poetry and painting are on the similar path. If you are familiar with the thing that is depicted in a painting, then and then you can able to have pleasure of that particular thing. Now, if you see very carefully what he is interested in and how he discussed the concept of imitation, Aristotle is even pointing out that this act of recognition involves an exercise of our capacity for cognition, and the exercise of any capacity is in itself pleasurable. Now, this what Aristotle said in chapter number 4 of Poetics is one of many in which Aristotle refers to painting and the visual arts. He mentioned these things. The statement which I right now read, this act of recognition involves an exercise of our capacity for cognition, and the exercise of any capacity is in itself pleasurable. Now, if you look at this statement, Aristotle is interested in bringing this statement in concern with painting and the visual arts, especially in order to make a specific point about poetry. He regards all these analogies are valid because what Aristotle believes, both painting and poetry to be form of mimesis. This is the very specific word he has used, mimesis. He says that poetry and painting, both the things are form of mimesis, a word which is translated mimesis as translated as imitation. Many scholars would object to this meaning of the word mimesis as imitation. Some of the critics used to call it as a representation. And all the translations are, of course, to some extent inadequate because we don't know exactly the old Greek, as I mentioned it in my early lectures, that there are various controversies regarding to the translation of old Greek. And that's why many scholars object this translation or meaning of mimesis as imitation. But it is inadequate to point out, to comment on that. But a close, you can say, meaning of mimesis is imitation rather than representation. Even it is by no means perfect translation. But again, there are reasons why representation may be not so much helpful in this context, what we are discussing today. I'm not saying representation is wrong, representation is not correct translation of the word mimesis. But mimesis, as most of the critics used to call it as a representation, also may not be suitable for the context that we are discussing with painting and poetry. Why? Because firstly, it fails to capture an essential element in what Aristotle's concept of mimesis. It is not capturing the essential thing, what Aristotle means by mimesis. That it does not suitable, it does not mix a conventional understanding of mimesis. Why this does not gives a conventional meaning of representation to mimesis? For example, when you're moving on the road to an airport, there is an arbitrary symbol of airport. Now, this symbol, arbitrary symbol of airport that is on that particular map, it represents airport, but this representation doesn't mean it is airport. This is purely conventional that you should understand that there is airport. This symbol on the arbitrary symbol on the map, whatever symbol it may be, I'm not discussing that symbol. The symbol is representing airport, but it is not imitating the airport. Now, the symbol is not mimesis of airport. Please understand this. Mimesis of airport. On the other hand, a scaled outline of it runways, what you see on the map, scaled outline of the runways. That scaled map can be called as an imitation of airport on paper because it has given the whole dimension that, okay, this is what it represents. It is imitating the airport. And Aristotle is quite explicit in linking mimesis and similarity. In certain cases, we would find it ought to speak for imitation also. For example, because what I said, it is not the correct meaning of the word mimesis, either imitation or representation. I have given you an example of how it is to be called as a representation and how it is to be called as an imitation. But if you look what Aristotle is interested, what Aristotle is trying to linking mimesis, he elaborated it. For example, how he elaborated it, uh, that melody and rhythm, melody and rhythm can be likenesses and imitations of character and emotion. I will read once again what he said. Melody and rhythm can be likenesses and imitations of character and emotion, effectively equating these two terms together. Melody, rhythm, character, and emotions, equating these two terms together. Now, secondly, representation fails to capture the full range of Aristotle's concept. It is not capturing the whole idea of Aristotle. The use of this quasi technical term of modern aesthetics may tend to obscure the continuity which Aristotle perceives between mimesis in painting and poetry and music and in other non-artistic forms of activity. You may find, such as animal noises and sounds, or children's play, acting. These things you may find out that there is some sort of misunderstanding or some sort of not knowing properly what Aristotle is interested in pointing out about mimesis. This debate, this argument is essential to Aristotle in chapter number 4 of Poetics. This is his basic argument in chapter number 4 of Poetics. His point, there is precisely that poetry is an expression of an human instinct. Poetry is an expression of a human instinct for mimesis that is also displayed and in more elementary forms of behavior. That what sort of expressions human being is trying to bring out, it comes in the form of poetry. So the poetry is nothing but a sort of imitation. You can say a poetry, a sort of representation of human emotions. You can also say that. But that is a very elementary form of behavior. Now, Aristotle's contention is that human beings are by nature prone to engage in creation of likeness, and they are waiting for the response for the likeness. Now, the response for likeness with pleasure. And he explains this particular instinct of human being by reference to their innate desire for knowledge. This is a very common human instinct. You can get it with various examples in our day to day life also. You're searching for those people who are of same likeness and same minded, same likeness. People come close to each other very quickly. They come to close very quickly. And that's why Aristotle is trying to point out that this is basic human instinct, that human being uh, is interested in creation of likeness. He tried to create something which is liked by himself, and he expect that this should be liked by other people also with pleasure. And this likeness, what he creates, is simply his desire for knowledge. That's why he has created all those things. Now, a likeness is a, if you go by definition, likeness is a likeness of something. Likeness is likeness of something. To take part and respond in the activity of making. To take part in the activity of making. You are making something and you are taking part into that activity of making and responding to likeness. You are responding to likeness by making it once again. A simple thing to understand with too many cookery shows. You're trying to make something after watching that cookery show. The person who is making in the cookery show, that person is preparing that particular thing and you are watching it, and then you are trying to prepare it with the same likeness, activity of likeness, and responding it with pleasure. Now, we must recognize in this case that the relationship between likeness on one hand and its object on the other hand. There is a relationship between the two things. Now, this relationship between likeness and object, what you make or what object you try to make depends on your likeness. Because the object which you make, you should try to make, is simply because you like it. Otherwise, you will not make it. That's very basic human instinct. And because you like it and to know that how it is being made, you try to make it with pleasure. Now, this relationship between the likeness and its object engages and satisfies the desire, which is a human power, distinctively human power of understanding. Because what you like, what you like with pleasure, you involved in activity of making it, and the likeness and its object engages and satisfies the desire to exercise our distinctively human power of understanding. And this is this understanding, this human power of understanding is nothing but it is a pleasure. By making certain things, please remember, we have started it with imitation and representation. We have tried to find out the meaning or translation of mimesis, as usually most of the Scholars used to translate it as imitation. Some translators used to point it as a representation. So, how it is not proper to call it at sometimes as a representation and sometimes as imitation, we have also discussed with an example of a map or symbol, arbitrary symbol on map of airport. We cannot call this as airport, imitation of airport. We call it as a representation of airport. But a scaled map can tell you that okay, this is the imitation of airport. There is a difference between the word called representation and imitation. Now, what you try to make, what you try to imitate, what you try to bring, because the things which you want to create, it is liked by you, and that's why you are trying to make it and wants that this particular thing to be liked by others also. And that's why what you are doing, you are trying or you are making an object which is liked by all of you, including yourself. And the person who is liking that person is liking with a sort of pleasure with it. And that's why there is a correlationship a relationship between likeness and its objects, and this likeness and its object always engages and satisfies desire to exercise our distinctive human power of understanding, because we are understanding it, and once you understand it, it results in pleasure. Now this exercise of our capacity for understanding is, to be sure, rudimentary one. It is rudimentary. If you go by the whole understanding of psychoanalysis, this understanding is rudimentary. But Aristotle's purpose here, arguing this thing in his chapter number 4 of Poetics, Aristotle's purpose here to explain how poetry and painting are rooted in basic instincts shared by even the least intellectually sophisticated people. This is rooted in. It doesn't require a intellectual and sophisticated person to say that okay, this poetry and painting is rooted in me. No, poetry and painting are rooted in the basic instincts, and when these two things are part of basic instincts of each and everyone, Aristotle discerns the roots of philosophy in a primitive sense of wonder. As I have given you the same sort of example, the example that we are trying to, as I have already discussed with you in earlier talk also, that when you try to find out that, as I have told you in my first or second lecture, supposed to be that how uh, a primitive man may find an awful situation, may find himself in that awful situation when he sees first time the sun is rising from the east with a red ball slowly coming up from one corner of one side of the land which he can see and moving towards the other side of land. This primitive, you can say, sense of wonder, what Aristotle says is responsible for the roots of philosophy. Now, please understand this fact that there is no implication that philosophy has been explained away or cheap or in a cheapened way, that by giving these type of examples, that what Aristotle is saying, primitive sense of understanding, primitive sense of wonder, we have to understand the roots that Aristotle is trying to discern, that how philosophy is. What he said, what I discussed quite time before, that creating or engaged in an activity of likeness and responding the likeness is nothing but understanding what you say. You are simply driving to the cause of understanding, and this understanding leads to pleasure. This pleasure of wonder is nothing but a part of human life, and that's why it is giving birth to philosophy. So, calculating it very simply in a mathematical sense, Aristotle is trying to bring out that philosophy is engaged in that particular sense. Likewise, the contention that poetry is ultimately explicable as an expressions of elementary human desire for knowledge does not and is not mean to provide an exhaustive account of poetry. It is not at all giving an exhaustive account of. Aristotle, in the same chapter, traced the development of poetry from primitive improvisation to increasingly complex and sophisticated form. The same chapter, because this may create a sort of question in the minds of most of the readers and especially most of us, that does Aristotle interest in pointing out that poetry is nothing but an expression of a primitive mind, expression of primitive understanding, the desire of understanding of a primitive man and desire of understanding that roots in human instinct? In the same chapter, Aristotle moves on that development of poetry, the history of poetry, we'll discuss in later lectures. What Aristotle talked about the history of poetry. Now, this chapter, which traces the development of poetry from primitive improvisation to increasingly complex and sophisticated form, we shall see in the due course of understanding of poetics that it implies a correspondingly complex analysis of what poetry has offers to its audiences. We'll see to it that how poetry, uh, the complex analysis of what poetry has to offer to its audiences, as the notion of poetry as imitation. Poetry is an imitation. If you see very carefully, the notion of poetry as imitation raises various complex problems which are not to be discussed here when we talk about Aristotle, because when we move ahead with Sir Philip Sidney or when we move ahead with William Wordsworth, we will find out, even we move ahead with mm, the two uses of language, we can find out that how these complex problems elaborately discussed by later on scholars and later on critics. But some points must be stressed here when we are arguing with Aristotle's notion of mimesis. Some points need to be stressed. Some points need to be looked upon. Now, an imitation need not to be a straightforward copy of object. It usually comes in our mind. If someone asks you what exactly means by imitation, we try to find out that imitation is nothing but a copy of that particular object. The similarity between the object and its likeness, similarity between its object and its likeness may reside in more oblique and abstract correspondence. Because if you see very carefully, there is a sort of correspondence between these two things. Likeness, or you can say the object, as we have discussed it before, that develops the desire of human understanding, distinctive power of human understanding. Now, there is some abstract correspondence, there is an oblique correspondence between object and likeliness. Suppose I give you one simple example to understand this oblique or abstract correspondence. You heard music. Usually we hear music. Radio plays some songs, or your MP3 and lots of things. Someone likes Western music, someone likes Indian classical music, someone likes folk music. You like music. What is the correspondence between music and your likeness? Have you created music? No. But you like the music created by someone. Music and likeness, there's an abstract correspondence between the two. Because likeness with pleasure, but it is not created by you. You cannot create. I can't play any musical instrument. It doesn't mean that I don't like music. I can't play with brush and colors. It doesn't mean that I don't like paintings. That means there is an oblique between object and likeness. Why I'm saying oblique between object and likeness? Object, when you make that, it has to be made. Now, someone has made it. That object you like. How you are liking it? You are liking it with pleasure. Now, an imitation, not to be considered a likeness of an object which actually exists. Please understand, on this imitation, Plato rejects the poets to stay in his ideal state, because he said imitation is nothing but a lie. And in ideal state, a person who lies is not having any place. And that's why we have to understand this idea of imitation very carefully. We have seen techne, which is innate desire, and on the other hand, we are talking about imitation. Look at these basic concepts that Aristotle is trying to bring in front of us. Now, an imitation need not to be a likeness of an object which actually exists. Now, Aristotle cleared this in chapter number 9. Aristotle cleared this idea. And that's why I said, my friends, I'm not going to discuss the whole Poetics, chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in that linear format. We are talking about his major concepts that Aristotle is trying to discuss in his Poetics. The first one we have discussed as techne. Now we are talking about imitation, mimesis. Now, this idea that an imitation need not to be a likeness of an object which actually exists, Aristotle clears it in chapter number 9. And there you will find out Aristotle is indifferent to the events recounted in poem. Events recounted in poems did or did not happen in reality. A poet writes a poem. Now, the events which he has discussed in the poem, not essential that those events that the poet discussed in his writings may actually have taken place in life. Now, if you look at historiographical texts, I'm not saying history, historiographical texts, these historiographical texts are usually judged by the criteria of fidelity to real events. The text which we are reading in history and the text which we are reading in, I'm giving a very, very, very contemporary example to you, reading in historiographical fiction. And that's why you will find out, my friends, in every uh, movie history which is based on history or movie which is based on some real life, the first line comes as a disclaimer that this is a mere fictional story. And if anything resembles with real life or actual event seems to be coincidence, we have not depicted the real event. Disclaimer always comes whenever you watch any movie or any film, you will find out the disclaimer is always there. Why there is a disclaimer? The reason is historiographical text always judged on the criteria of fidelity to the real events, whether they are fidel, whether they are close, or whether they are depicting the real thing as it is in text. But in poem, if you are reading a poetry, if you are reading a drama, and you need not to show that this is what happened real, this is not a incidence of real life thing. Although what we usually use to define that literature is nothing but a reflection of society. Whatever is appearing in literature need not to happen in real life also. And that's why Aristotle's concept of poetry as imitation is therefore consistent with that of fiction, although it is not identical to that fiction. The concept of poetry, as I have said you, that the disclaimer always. Because what is reflected in a poem, again I'm repeating the same thing, my friends. Poem doesn't mean the writing of poetry in a specific format. As I said, poem is also to be called as a creative writing or drama also. Poem is not at all What Aristotle's concept of poetry as imitation is therefore consistent with fiction, although that is not identical to it. Now, indeed, the events in poem do not even have to confirm the basic structure of reality. When Wordsworth, in his Daffodils, writes that I saw 10,000 at a glance. You are not asking a question to Wordsworth, where these 10,000 you have seen, please give me the location, geographical map of that place. I want to search it whether there are actually 10,000 or not. No reader has ever asked any question. No reader had asked any question to Aristotle, or nor we ever think to ask a question about its existence in reality. Or when John Keats talk about a Grecian urn that he saw, an urn where Greek life is portrayed, you never ask anyone that where is that Grecian urn, in which museum this Grecian urn is kept. Or when Shelley used to say that he saw a cuckoo, you are not saying, or you are not replying that, okay, not my cuckoo said that particular, as Shelley, your cuckoo said it. Because we know that what Aristotle's concept of imitation, and what Aristotle is trying to bring it out, that poems do not even confirm the basic structure of reality. The Aristotle's dictum that poetry is concerned, please understand this. This is a very important one, what I am saying right now. Aristotle's dictum that poetry is concerned not with what has happened. Poetry is not concerned not with what has happened, but the kind of thing that would happen. This is Aristotle's dictum of poetry. Aristotle's dictum that poetry is not poetry is concerned not with what has happened, but with the kind of thing that would happen. That is what is possible in accordance with probability or necessity. Please understand it. In usually Hindi we used to say जो न देखे रवि वो देखे कवि. What sun can't see, the poet can see. That is what in Hindi used to say about poet. So what Aristotle's dictum is, Aristotle's dictum is poetry is concerned not with what has happened, but what would happen. That is, when you say what would happen, it is related with possibility. This is the possibility. Or necessity. That necessary it will happen. Or probably it will happen. That means it has given two different dimensions to understanding. Possible, compulsion. These are the two different dictums. These are the two different ways that poetry has given. And this can be understood. This must be read. I'm using the word must be. This must be read in the light of application of his critical principles. There are certain critical principles Aristotle has given, and those critical principles he had not explained early. He explained those critical principles in chapter number 25 later on. That means the argument of imitation is running throughout poetics. These critical principles to understand, to read this two things, possible or necessity. Aristotle is simply trying to use this in the light of application of his critical principles in chapter number 25. For example, Aristotle did not believe that the theology built into Greek myths was true. There are so many Greek myths, as we have so many myths in our Indian society also. So, what theology is built upon, Aristotle is not at all accepting that theology was built upon the Greek myths. But unlike to some of the earlier philosophers, including Plato, he had no objection to poetic plots based on them. Theology was not coming out of Greek myths, but poetry is coming out of these Greek myths because most of the poems are based on these myths. That was a claim made by early philosophers and even Plato also. And that's why a poem which recounts the action, a poem which discusses about the action of a vengeful deity is not at all imitation of something which, in Aristotle's view, does or could exist in real world. If you read Sophocles' Oedipus the King very carefully, you will find out that there was plague in the state. People were dying due to certain disease in the city of Athens. Why? Because when they visited to the temple of Apollo, they got a message from Apollo that there is a blunder sin committed by some of the person of that one of the persons of the town, and that's why this is a curse. This is what a poet has created in his writings. Because when you talk about God, he is vengeful, he is taking revenge against certain things. Aristotle said this is not at all related with the reality. Now, here you will say that this is what Aristotle's scientific approach towards looking at the things. That's why Aristotle says when a poem which recounts the action of a vengeful deity is not an imitation of something which does or could even exist in real world. Here is no possibility nor necessary. But but it is an imitation of a kind of thing which would necessary or probable happen if the traditional beliefs about God was true. If the traditional belief about God, the same sort of, please understand, there is no difference, there is no big, huge difference in Indian understanding of God and Greek understanding of God. Both the mythologies, Indian mythology and Greek mythologies, are supposed to be the ancient mythologies of the world. That's why I need not to explain that what Indian mythology talks about God, a traditional belief that God would take a sort of revenge, but you haven't seen happen in real life, happen in true life. That is a scientific temperament. And that's why Aristotle is saying what is reflected in a poetry need not to happen in real life. You cannot account it. And that's why he has even given an example of an historical text, that what happened in historical text, you can judge that event that reflected in historical text with the fidelity to the real event. But you cannot judge it with poetry, fidelity to real event. Because there is an understanding that poet is saying something, poet is trying to depict something which may, that would happen, that what would happen, because there is again a concept of probability and necessity. This concept of probability and necessity even continues with Sir Philip Sidney also in the next essay. That means what Aristotle is trying to talk about imitation is that we have to understand the imitation with probable or necessary understanding of it. And for understanding this, he has given certain principles of criticism, principles of critical principles to understand, to read this in the application, how to apply this, how to read this in chapter number 25. When we move ahead, we'll talk about that issue also. But if you see very carefully, my friend, Aristotle is trying to bring out all those things. He's trying to explore that thing. He's trying to explore the idea of mimesis. That's why when I said in my very first lecture that what we are supposed to understand, what we are supposed to talk about, we are supposed to talk about the major four basic central concepts of Aristotle's that reflect in poetics. Those concepts. The first is techne, which we discussed in last 2 3 lectures. We have started with imitation, the second concept. The third is nothing but hamartia, and fourth is catharsis. All these four things we will discuss step by step, and these four central concepts, when we discuss, we are able to get close with Aristotle's poetics. Because I'm not saying that we can understand or we understand Aristotle's poetics thoroughly. Not at all. It's not our claim. But we are precisely looking at, we are precisely trying to get close with what Aristotle is trying to bring out. And that's why we need to understand that when Aristotle is talking about poetry, when Aristotle is discussing about poetry, we need to understand that what exactly it means by poetry. And for that understanding of anything, we need to understand its history, that how it appears in history. And with the history, you can able to develop a rationale to find out a principle of understanding of how the poetry came into. And that's why we will discuss what Aristotle's idea of history of poetry, what Aristotle's history of poetry, how he is trying to bring out the poetry. And in the beginning of chapter number 4, as I said, that Aristotle is ultimately trying to find out the anthropological roots of establishing poetry. Aristotle is trying to find out the anthropological roots of establishing poetry. Aristotle even goes on to sketch the process by which the more sophisticated forms of poetry evolved. And the theoretical framework to this outline of this history of poetry is developed in the first 3 chapters of uh, Poetics, which construct a matrix of 3 different ways in which poems can be distinguished from other forms of imitations or from each other, in terms of his very famous 3 ideas of medium, object, and mode. All those things we will discuss in Thursday. Tomorrow I'm not available. I'm at a meeting tomorrow by 10:30. So I'll let you know either by a notice put on our Teachment app, Or may I ask that tomorrow if you can able to come in the evening, or may I take it on Sunday? What's your opinion? Because once we will complete this, then we can able to move ahead, and that's why tomorrow we are not going to have a very proper understanding of all those things. So we are not conducting lecture tomorrow. We will conduct it on Thursday.